Welcome back. We covered a little bit of the 1950s, and now we're going to backtrack a little bit to cover the late 50s and the dominant forces of the 1960s, which, along with the Cold War and along with that bipolarity of the world, and you see where communist countries are versus the Soviet bloc versus US and our NATO allies and ANZUS allies, we're going to have to go back and at the end of the war, we have to start with the beginnings of the civil rights movement. Okay, and that's going to stretch into the administration of Kennedy. It's going to stretch into the administration of Eisenhower, and the beginnings of that actually begin a little bit earlier. They begin with Truman, for the most part. He's going to have all manner of political and moral reasons to live up to the high ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the ironies entailed in there that in our founding documents we write, all men created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and yet we have alienated so many of those rights from a large segment of our population through systematic and legal apparatus. And so once you've fought for the second time in 20 years to make the world, or 30 years to make the world safe for democracy, you now have to live up to the ideas that you've put out to the wider world. And it's going to be the Soviet Union that's going to highlight that and use that to a great extent. In Soviet propaganda, they don't care about color, they don't care about creed, they don't care about race. All they care about is whether you would take their money and be a friend to the communist state. Whereas the United States is going to have loads of preconditions on all of their aid and all of their assistance, mainly whether you're going to be communist or anti-communist. So that's going to color what we do in the 40s and into the 50s. But Truman, being a very godly man, is going to believe that he has moral reasons, and as the Democratic Party is evolving, he's going to believe he needs to speak to that voice, to speak to that populace, and draw them into the voter base that is growing. And so in December of 46, while Truman is serving out the first few years after the death of FDR, he's going to establish a committee on civil rights, and they're going to start to call for voting rights legislation, anti-lynching and anti-segregation legislation. And this does represent the first time since our failed attempts at Reconstruction that the federal government is acknowledging that it has a responsibility for acts of personal organizational racism and not leaving it up to the states, because leaving it up to the states is where we've seen that. And so what we're going to see are committees set up, and commissions set up, the Fair Employment Board of the Civil Service Commission set up, and a committee on equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. And we are going to start to see for the first time, fighting in Korea, United Nations integrated units. Now, these are not without troubles, but we are going to see the earliest attempts at trying to live up to the ideas of World War II in reality, both on the military field as well as at home. And so this is a major milestone. In so many different ways, the depression of World War II has changed America forever. We're embracing the pastoral care role that the federal government has for its people, and you're going to embrace it and you're going to expand upon it. You're going to legislate for it, and we're still seeing the fruits of that ongoing right now. But when we start looking at how we're going to dismantle the edifice of Jim Crow, you have to do it through the Supreme Court, and you have to destroy separate but equal. Okay? Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 had set the standard that there is no harm to the individual races with equal provision of separate facilities. What we need to do is make sure that you can prove the strictest letter of the law is separate equal. Okay? Not that there is inherent inequality in the separation of the races and all that, but you just hold up two water fountains next to each other. Is one equal to the other? Hold up accommodation. Is one equal to the other? And through that, you're going to show that accommodations are not equal. And you're going to show that separate is not. And it's these series of small victories that get public awareness across the 40s and into the early 50s that is creating an activism in the educated African American middle class. As so often is the case, sports leads the way on racial issues, and baseball in 1947 will lead that way with the integration of the major leagues and the first player for the Brooklyn Dodgers and Branch Rickey to break that color barrier in the major leagues. Branch Rickey bringing Jackie Robinson on board for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, today, baseball isn't the national pastime that it was. It wasn't the obsession that it was. But in 1947, Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier into the major leagues was an enormous cultural phenomenon and an avenue for change that is going to continue to go forward. Now, the series of small victories challenging the letter of Plessy v. Ferguson does get some progress. But as we move into the 50s, it becomes obvious that you need to have Plessy v. Ferguson declared unconstitutional. And so Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka is going to challenge the constitutionality of Plessy v. Ferguson. And of course it is struck down, deemed unconstitutional, inherently saying separate is inherently unequal, something that we can all see today. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court is not as deliberate when it says these things must be dismantled. There is no timetable attached. And by 1955, they clarify and say that your orders, Supreme Court orders to desegregate, must be done with all deliberate speed. And I don't know how you guys interpret the word deliberate, but for me, that means a very plodding, a very slow, deliberate pace. Do you need to plan first? Do you need to delay first? The Supreme Court, if we remember back to our constitutional days and back to the Judiciary Act of 1789, they were given powers called writs of mandamus by Congress for just such a case, just like Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, in that they could command anyone holding an office to perform an act. Now, Marbury v. Madison in 1803 is going to strike that down, is going to deem that unconstitutional. This was the foresight of the Founding Fathers at this point. They knew that the Supreme Court needed a certain amount of ability to compel office holders to act upon unpopular decisions. But because we don't have those powers, they've been deemed outside the delineated powers of Congress to grant those to the Supreme Court. We put no timetable, we can't compel, and the lack of time frame and the lack of compulsion powers opens up desegregation to delay, obfuscation, and resistance. And it's going to be that resistance that will manifest itself in the form of revival of the Ku Klux Klan and resistance to integration. Okay. So the Klan resurfaces blaming race mixing on communist instigators. Okay. And now when we're looking at segregation, we're looking at two different types of segregation that existed in America. De jure, which is by law, that's Jim Crow, that's in the South, and de facto, just by the simple fact. Harlem and Manhattan sort of developed into a segregated neighborhood, not by law, but just by fact. So what we need to see is both in the North and the South, there are significantly segregated neighborhoods, towns, and schools, whether it's simply by a fact or whether it is by law. And so that type of segregation needs to be attacked, not just in the South, but also in the North. Now, when Truman leaves office, as Brown v. Board of Education is coming on board, Eisenhower is certainly not the activist, not the moralist that Truman was. He's not going to push for integration. He thought it was damaging to the Republican Party in the South with his just getting going, and he thought it would hinder military operations in the Cold War, as most of your large training facilities are in the South. And so for the longest time, Eisenhower is going to allow this resistance to happen simply by lack of motivation from his part or inaction from the government. And certainly we are going to have to see ugly confrontations. They're going to have to happen, and they are continuing to happen as we come to grips with the legacy of failed Reconstruction. But it comes to a head in 1957, and it centers around Little Rock, Arkansas's Central High School. There were going to be African American students beginning the school year at Central High School. Arkansas's Governor Orville Faubus promised blood running in the streets if African Americans came to his schools, and deploys National Guardsmen to turn the black students away. Eisenhower, or better known as Ike, is forced into action because all of this is playing out on national television at this point. From 53 into 54, you've got nightly content, you've got nightly news, you've got a high percentage of the population who will have a television. Roughly half of the population might have a television in their home. So urban environments that have no idea what's going on in Central Arkansas, they're going to see it on the nightly news. They're going to see the pictures. They're going to see the images that are coming out. So Eisenhower's forced to nationalize that guard and send in 1,000 paratroopers, all to make sure that high school students go to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And you see the specter of many African American children going to Central High School, and the anger, the hate, and of course race mixing is communism. And one of my favorite sort of just non sequiturs in terms of the signs and the protests, holding the American flag and protesting all of this. So across the 50s, you'll see the resistance to segregation, by law segregation in the South, and the impact of television can be seen even today. You know, we can read newspaper accounts of things that happened, of events that have happened, but it's decidedly a different thing when we see the video of something happen. Visual, whether it is a photograph or whether it is a video, certainly strikes at the heart of people and Americans more than simply written words. We are very much a visual culture, and that one really does strike at America. And whether you didn't want to know or didn't know or couldn't know what was going on in the Deep South, now as more and more protests and more demonstrations start to happen, there's no way to avoid it. And of course, in Montgomery, Alabama, the protests over segregated buses centers around Rosa Parks. Okay. Now, Rosa Parks is going to be arrested for failing to go to the colored section of a bus. And giving up a seat. The colored section was full. She sat in the white section. She did not move and would not go to the back of the bus. Now, this was a perfect opportunity and a perfect time to protest this, and the courage of Ms. Parks and everyone else associated with this in terms of nonviolent protests, of simply calling attention to these cases, of bringing the attention of the country to what is actually happening. And the man to serve as a symbol is a newly ordained minister, a young Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King is going to trade upon other pacifists, if you will, in terms of protesting for equal rights or civil rights, in particular, Mahatma Gandhi and others, and that nonviolent protests of civil disobedience certainly was the course that King is going to follow. Now, there's going to be loads of other African American pioneers that will not follow as strictly the nonviolent and just the simple civil disobedient path. Some are going to believe that this is going to take too long and it's simply not going to draw the attention that's necessary. But Martin Luther King is going to have the great power of oratory skills, of evoking the Bible and religious imagery. And of course, one of his famous quotes after Parks is arrested is talking about the demonstrations, and that if they were wrong, the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. And if you've ever heard Dr. King speak, the combination of oratory skill and reverential delivery in that rhythmic opportunity to deliver an impassioned speech is brilliant. And we've seen it with so many social campaigners as well as politicians, that if you can enlist the power of the pulpit and powerful oratory, well, you can do virtually anything. Well, in terms of the bus boycott, this lasts for 13 months. And by the time that the Supreme Court is going to declare the segregation of buses unconstitutional, by this point, MLK is at the front of a national stage. But meanwhile, Eisenhower is still intent on quashing this, because in his mind, it detracts from the efforts of the Cold War. This type of publicity on a world stage distracts from the Cold War that he is trying to fight with the Soviet Union, and it weakens our country and it weakens our military. So Eisenhower is certainly up for criticism during all of this. And as I said, the impact on America is going to be through televisions. And, I remember the days of these gigantic console televisions with the CRT tubes and the heft and the center point of these in a living room. It replaces the radio in terms of being the focal point for household living and the household community. And what the television is going to give us through nightly content is going to be the American dream served on a plate. The very old, at this point now, black and white sitcoms, Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. They're going to show you what, I guess, Hollywood thought the American dream was. And it was the nuclear family. It was the 2.2 kids, the dog and the white picket fence, and the mom that stayed home, and the dad that went to work in a suit and drove a Hudson or drove a Buick. Those were marks of how to be American. And of course, the television was a part of that American dream. They were expensive, roughly $300 for a set in 1953, which was significant in terms of cost. It's a lot of money back in those days. And if we were to equate it, you could get a high-end car for around $4,000 to $5,000. And so high-end cars today, 70, 80, equating 300 to that percentage-wise, you're looking at a couple of $1,000s for a television, yet 50%, if not more, of the homes, and I still remember talking to my dad the first time he had to go to somebody else's house to see a television. But the uptick on this is going to be extensive, and by 1960, more than 90% of the homes in the nation have a television. More people have a TV than a washing machine or an iron. And when we look at what these shows are selling in the midst of the Cold War, they're selling white, homogeneous, middle class, wholesome Americana. And now we've only seen that trend moving away in the 80s and 90s and in, of course, the 2010s, where we see a much more racially diverse experience. And you can point to some of the pioneers of that. The Cosby Show was the first African American centered, enormously popular sitcom. But you could point back to the 1970s with sitcoms like What's Happening and the first sitcom of the Jeffersons to have an African American couple as their center, but also the Jeffersons were the first to have an interracial couple on television. So the media is going to have its impact on American culture. It's just significantly delayed, and we're only now seeing the push for equal representation on television of all races, all creeds, all colors. Now, the massive impact that the media is going to have is going to be on politics. And particularly the first time where television has an enormous impact is going to be on the presidential election of 1960. Now, for most of you guys, you don't remember, the early days of debates and of imagery and the need to create a presidential look. We've had an odd relationship with the media in the last decade and a half in terms of debates and in terms of the presidential election of 1960 saw the first debate widely televised between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president, and it really set the stage between a JFK that looked cool, confident, and young versus a Nixon who looked older, haggard, sweaty, distrustful. It became the first time that people's imagery got in the way of what they were hearing. And they've done studies about the presidential debate in 1960. And then if you listen to it on the radio, you said Nixon won hands down. But if you watched it on television, invariably you thought Kennedy won. He just looked calmer. He'd had good makeup. He had a good shave. He looked calm. He looked presidential. Whereas Nixon sounded presidential, but he had poor makeup. The lighting did not favor him. He had a heavy beard, so he looked like he had a 5 o'clock shadow even after he had just shaved. He didn't have a tan or good makeup, and he was warm under the lights. And so he looked shifty. He looked uncomfortable. He looked less presidential. And hence why Kennedy won. Kennedy also is young, inexperienced, and he really didn't have a whole lot of hot takes on a lot of the controversial issues at the time, but he was very young at the time, the youngest president we're ever going to elect. He was the first president born in the 20th century. He served in World War II, and he had been in the House and in the Senate for 3 terms, but had built really an unimpressive record. And he squeaks his way to the 1960 victory. People were worried about his youth. He was a Roman Catholic, which still bothered people, worrying about whether he was going to do what the Pope told him to do or seek American interests first. But nevertheless, he's going to be elected by that very slim margin, and we know about slim margins. This one is a fairly slim one. And what he's going to do is surround himself with young, talented people. He is, of course, 43, and he's going to describe the people he surrounds himself with are the best and the brightest. Dean Rusk at State is the elder statesman at 52. This after we've just had an election with two men in their late 70s being elected. JFK himself, 43. His brother, Robert, is 35. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at 44. So these men are going to represent his brain trust that he is going to surround himself with. And the major policy decision is going to be about what to do in terms of the Cold War and how to respond. Well, they developed their doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction, wherein America needs to prevent a Soviet first strike by having second strike capabilities that cannot be knocked out. And if you've ever watched any of these shows about war games or the beginnings of wars, what are you trying to do? You're trying to knock out their command and control facilities, and you're trying to knock out their first strike capabilities. Well, for the 1960s, we're trying to spread out nuclear weapons all around the world so that there is no way in a first strike the Soviet Union can prevent our ability for launching multiple weapons that would, of course, destroy the Soviet Union as well. And so when we're planning all of this, we assume first strike is going to come from the Soviets. So we need to have constant B-52 bombers with nuclear weapons flying in the air so they can't be diverted. We need to have submarines with nuclear weapons. We need to have nuclear weapons hidden in the wheat fields of Kansas, so that if they try to take out our command and control facilities, it's too diverse and too spread out. Hence the doctrine MAD. Now, subsequently, we're going to believe that it was in fact mad, meaning insane. The notion of proliferation, the notion of putting weapons all around the world is problematic. In the end, Kennedy is going to have an incredibly difficult first year, cleaning up some of the messes left to him by Eisenhower and the CIA. In 1961, the Soviet Union begins building the famous Berlin Wall, what they call brain drain, the creep of defectors leaving East Berlin to get to the West, to get out of communist-held territories, precipitated the building of a formal hard barrier. And if you still go to Berlin today, you can still walk through sections that still have, if not the footprint of it, there are still a few sections of the wall up as tourist traps at this day and age. But for right now, the other part of the catastrophic first year was that, congratulations, you're now president. And oh, by the way, the CIA has been working on a plan to land Cuban exiles, arm them so they can lead an insurrection to depose Fidel Castro in Cuba. 1,200 of them land in what becomes known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. They're easily rounded up, and this was a major foreign policy embarrassment for Kennedy, when it was an Eisenhower plan. It was an Eisenhower approved CIA operation. He's just simply the president that was, cleaning up the mess. Now it gets worse in 1962 for Kennedy. The Soviets start deploying first strike capability weapons to Cuba. And the image here shows these mobile rocket launchers setting up in Cuba. October 16th, a U-2 spy plane spots the missiles deploying, beginning what was probably the scariest 13, 14 days in American history, the closest we come to a nuclear war during this whole period. Now, American missiles are in Turkey. They're in, by virtue of bombers, in the NATO bloc countries. The Soviets felt like they needed another fast response, and so 90 miles off the coast of Florida, they deploy these nuclear missiles, short-range tactical nuclear weapons that could strike at Washington in 15-20 minutes. The United States is going to demand the removal of them and institute a naval blockade of Cuba to make sure that there were no other missiles coming, but also to send a message to the Soviets that that's too close to home. In the end, what the Cuban Missile Crisis is a 2-week crisis where we're worried that a Soviet ship may not stop for an American blockade, that once shots start getting fired, that shots are going to continue, retaliation, nuclear annihilation. And one of the things you realize is that this is a crisis that's easily able to be solved. All you have to do is trade a few things. The Cuban missiles go away for the removal of missiles in Turkey. We're seeking, like we said, mutual assurance of destruction. Well, if we remove one class of weapons, you can remove the same. It's a fair trade. Meanwhile, the legacy of prudence is going to follow this crisis, because one of the things you realized at the height of the crisis, October 22, 23, 24, you could sit there and think, why doesn't the president just simply pick up the phone and call Nikita Khrushchev? Well, it's because there's no direct phone line. You have to telegram a message to the American consulate in Moscow, who then has to write it out, deliver it to the Soviets, and it has to be translated. You got to get that, and it's got to come back. There's no direct way for world leaders to talk efficiently. And this type of back and forth took a long time. And so the idea of a hotline is created, and that there's a phone in the Oval Office that if you needed to talk to the premier of the Soviet Union, you picked it up and it rang. It was a direct, secure line. There was another trade that the environmental impact of atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons on the Pacific Rim, where you are testing these weapons on the poor small islands out there in Bikini Atoll and all the others, there's no longer any viability in that. What more are you going to learn in terms of what does a nuclear weapon do when it detonates? So we do have a very prudent ban on atmospheric testing as well, coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Secondary to the delivery of weapons on rockets and the reliability of them and of their heavy lift capacity is going to be the race for space. Right? And like we said, the Russians have the upper hand in that very early on, and that their ability to deliver things into space and to put them up is highlighted by Sputnik. And then in Sputnik 2, they launched that again in 57, a bigger, more bells and whistles satellite. By 1960, they put dogs, the first dog, into space here, Laika. And they put rats, and they put flies, they put plants, fungi. They're testing it out because it is the purview of sci-fi that you don't know if there is some sort of spaceborne virus that is going to be brought back to Earth and kill everybody. So you're delivering animals up there with, for the Soviets, very little regard about whether they come home safely or not. It's for the experiment. Here in America, the part of the reason why we are behind is the safety features and the safeguards we have to put into place, because ours is done in the full light of the media, whereas out in Kazakhstan and Space City, there really is no media coverage of what the Soviets do if something goes wrong. The only time we know that they had a launch that failed is that our spy satellites or our reconnaissance aircraft would show a gigantic hole in the ground where their rocket blew up. Meanwhile, ours are done in the full light of day. Yuri Gagarin is going to become the first man to enter space in 1961, and then quickly followed for the Soviets by Valentina Tereshkova, reaching the first woman in space, and Alexei Leonov becoming the man to first have an extravehicular activity, EVA. The U.S. response to these Soviet firsts and its perception that we're losing the Cold War is to call for the Apollo program, or the Gemini program, that turns into the Apollo program running to space. The U.S. is going to call, and at Rice University down here in Houston, John F. Kennedy, in a very, very famous speech and video that you can Google search on, is going to even belittle Rice's football prowess as he delivers that at Rice University, calling for a commitment, calling for a national pride, and the result is going to be first the Gemini and then later Apollo programs that are going to succeed by the time we reach Apollo 11 and placing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Now, Kennedy is going to give a very stirring speech in 62. He's going to talk about why are we doing this? We do this because not because it is easy, but because it is hard. These are the battles worth fighting. We must not let the Soviet Union become the masters of space in a terrifying new realm of, or theater of war. And so we need to get up there first. And this mobilizes what becomes a $22 billion program that is successful in delivering the technological necessities of taking men from the Earth, setting them down on the moon, and then delivering them home safe. The LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, basically has the computing power of, well, really a simple calculator today, much less everything else. But the push, or a microwave, I guess you could say even, the push for the technology, the biggest thing that we get out of all of this, Velcro, is one of the things that we're going to see, this technological legacy that we get out of it. I always joke about, developing pens that will write in zero gravity. Well, why did we need to spend millions when a pencil works just fine? But the drive to create the Apollo program meant that you had to make everything more reliable, lighter, smaller, more durable. And the miniaturization of all of these things, the redundancy of these things, the technology applied to delivering all of these men back and forth is truly one of the great achievements of the American government. But meanwhile, while Kennedy is going to make this call, this great evocative call to develop the race for space and creating, Johnson Space Center down there in Houston, we really do still have the struggle for civil rights continuing through the 50s and into the early 60s. By the time Kennedy takes the presidency, very little had changed. About 7% of African Americans are in integrated schools, and segregation is still widespread. So what do we need to do? We need to make changes. We need to put sit-ins. We need to organize nonviolent protests. And sit-ins, and I don't know if any of you have seen the Netflix show Umbrella Academy, centers around and has some ties to these sit-ins and has some ties to the protests and the activities there in Dallas during this time period. But Greensboro and a whole host of other places across the South, anywhere where there was segregated dining, you just simply go there and sit. And you can see through the image, they poured flour, they poured sugar, they poured water, they poured whatever. And your goal was to simply get these photos taken, get into the headlines, bring more and more attention. Now, also bringing attention to segregation of buses and segregation of travel, you would have what was called Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders would get in buses without segregated compartments and try to highlight Jim Crow in the South. Now, you would publicize where these freedom rides are going, and they would, of course, be violently attacked as they move through the South. They would be firebombed. They would be halted. They would be attacked. And so you get iconic images of, sit-ins in North Carolina, and you get iconic images of these maps of where the Freedom Riders are headed through South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and of course the goal was to get to New Orleans. But the instances of violence and of attack, and here, a Greyhound bus that was burned out. All of this continues to bring publicity to the problems. And the more people that you can get involved, the better chance of success. And again, nightly news, images, video is going to continue to be the best friend for anyone in the South of trying to draw attention, because it's hard to ignore a video or a television or a newspaper picture or an image. And so when the problems continue, one of the criticisms of JFK would be that he wasn't as committed to the civil rights movement as you might expect or as you might hope. It wasn't an ironclad commitment, in part because he needed the South's votes. He had other programs that he wanted to do. He had other items and agenda items that he wanted to see done, and particularly the Cold War, and therefore you couldn't throw away the South by pushing too far into segregation. But nevertheless, the grassroots level had been very successful, and that almost compels Kennedy to act. And one of the most iconic images coming out of this is the children marching the front lines of protests in Birmingham, Alabama, thinking that commissioners and police commissioners like Bull Connor wouldn't use water cannons on children, some of them as young as 6. Unfortunately, Connor had no compunction about that. He saw protesters, they used water cannons. They trained police dogs down onto protesters. And television is going to highlight the evils of the world. And here you have an image of Bull Connor and water cannons being used as protesters just cower for protection from these, that have the ability to inflict terrible wounds and, if not, scour the skin off of protesters. On a weird sort of idea, I grew up with a friend whose father would never let him have a dog. And I always thought that was odd until I got older, and until I always thought it was me. And it's like, man, why is this guy not want his friends to have dogs? Well, he was African American and he grew up in the South, and he had protested during the 60s. And he'd had dogs sicked on him. And in his mind, he was never going to trust another dog. And those memories, and therefore he wouldn't let his son have a dog, at least around the house. And, some of these scars are tough to heal. And of course, as Kennedy is moving on some, not moving fast enough for others, Martin Luther King is going to deliver a speech in August of 1963 as 250,000 people descend on Washington, D.C., and he delivers the greatest speech of his life, articulating his dream for what America should be, could be, might be. The I Have a Dream speech has been quoted, has been referenced, has been used so often in the last 50 years as that crowning moment of King's career, trying to draw national attention to the problem standing out there in Washington, D.C., and elucidating that vision of equality and that vision of an end to racial segregation. Now, Kennedy's role in the civil rights movement is going to come to an abrupt end because of assassination. In Dallas, Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, Kennedy is going to be assassinated. I say his participation, but not his role. LBJ is now going to take up the cudgel to hammer onto the civil rights movement in a way that probably wouldn't have been possible if Kennedy had survived. Because I can invoke a martyr. I can invoke a president whose commitment wasn't as firm as people would have liked. But yet, in death, you're going to carry that legacy forward in a crusading form. Civil Rights Act in 1964 is going to, from the federal government, end legal segregation, and is going to provide the mechanisms necessary, at least from a federal point of view, to give the government to withhold federal funds from states who do not move in a quick enough pace, no more deliberate. This is a speedy process now. And we are going to see the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission created to help end some of the race-based hiring practices of private businesses. Again, the struggle still continues today. Now, off the heels of Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, is going to run against Barry Goldwater of the Republican Party. The Republicans are calling the Democrats soft on communism, that we need more defense, we need firmer action. LBJ had the real fear that he would lose because of the Civil Rights Act. He thought he delivered the South to the Republican Party for the rest of their lives. And of course, he is going to be the first Democrat to lose the South since Reconstruction, when Republicanism became a dirty word. But Goldwater talked tough on communism. He talked tough on the Cold War. He used an infamous ad. It was only, well, LBJ used an infamous ad called the Daisy ad. It was only used once. Because of that Republican rhetoric on the Cold War, LBJ is going to use this to imply that if you vote for Goldwater, you're voting for a nuclear holocaust. And I urge you to go and search, Google search the Daisy ad. It's very simple, you know, and beautifully simplistic. But this ad is the first real virulent political attack ad used, and it was only used once. It caused such a stir. Now, LBJ is going to win this election, and he is going to win re-election to his first term, him alone as a president. And for him, he's going to believe he's got a mandate now to help him sit down with Martin Luther King, to help him follow through on JFK's legacy. Voting Rights Act, Immigration Act, his war on poverty to make sure that there are federal funds for schools and housing, and to rectify the simple fact in the greatest nation on earth, as we would call it, 1/5 of the American people are living below the poverty line at a height when you've got a higher standard of living than America has ever enjoyed before, and people are hungry. In LBJ's mind, that was a scandal. We needed to make sure that voting rights were ensured. We needed to make sure that the quotas of the 1920s are removed, that we become the nation of give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. Well, that hadn't been the case for the last 40 years. Unfortunately for LBJ, all of his plans for poverty and the Great Society are going to fall victim to one conflict: Vietnam. The war in Vietnam is going to impoverish, derail, and basically make null and void reform movements. We talked about it before, about the fears of war prior to World War I, and the progressives, what kind of fears they had. That war kind of distracts and it consumes. Well, Vietnam is going to distract and it's going to consume. In part, it's fed by LBJ's bipolar view. Last year for John F. Kennedy, there were 16,000 advisors. And at the time of his death, it was unclear what JFK wanted. Through the lens of 1964. Today, the whole notion of limited war just doesn't make sense. We can see the folly in it. But in 1964, if we put them in their Cold War lens, LBJ is going to say, look, if I just put a few more troops there, maybe expand the conflict in North Vietnam, we can get victory. And the Tonkin Gulf incident is going to give LBJ exactly what he wanted. And it's still very unclear as to what happened out there, whether U.S. destroyers were engaged twice in 3 days by Vietnamese patrol boats. And here we have images of what could be Vietnamese patrol boats engaging American warships there. Cold War lens is going to tell us, strike on those boat bases and oil depots in North Korea and North Vietnam. And Congress is going to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The president now has the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces and to prevent further aggression. Does striking into North Korea, I don't know why I keep saying Korea, forgive me, North Vietnam, prevent further aggression? You bet it does. LBJ regarded this as, or even likened this resolution to Grandma's nightshirt. Said it covered everything. That he has the ability to do any and all things that he wanted. And the one thing that he's going to try to do is win the war. And so what I need to do is start bombing North Vietnam. We need to take the label of being soft on communism off of me. And he's going to institute from 65 to 68 Operation Rolling Thunder. 150,000 sorties of B-52 bombers dropping millions of ordnance, a million bombs onto targets in southern and northern Vietnam. Meanwhile, we're going to have to see a commensurate increase in troops in country. By 1968, you've got 500,000 troops in the country. And each time you put another division, each time you put another 50,000 men, Soviets and China increase their support for North Vietnamese forces. We can't de-escalate, we can't back down, because that, in the lens of the Cold War, made you soft. Soft on communism, soft on everything. So in America, the money, the manpower, the push, and even the optics of a very large America bombing a third world nation into obsolescence is becoming more and more difficult to take. And on the home front, LBJ is quickly becoming one of the more hated men in American history. George Kennan is going to say that this just doesn't make sense, and Secretary of Defense McNamara is going to say that this is an ugly image, an ugly optic of the greatest superpower killing and seriously injuring thousands of non-combatants, because we have embedded soldiers there highlighting friendly fire incidences and casualties on civilians. LBJ's Great Society is up in flames and is being destroyed by Vietnam. And this is the first time, I guess say second time in American history, that you'd seen this level of division and criticism. The criticism is new because news information is at an all-time high. And as escalation in Vietnam continues and the standard narrative coming out of the American government is not going to be 100% trusted. This is the beginning of people distrusting politicians. LBJ, Nixon, they ruin it for all of us. Today, a politician speaks and we simply don't believe them. But in the 40s and the 50s, people trusted and believed in their politicians. They believed in their representatives. Today, that's kind of been taken away from us. We're also willing to use protests, mass protests. And again, kind of mirroring what we're seeing in American society today, there is a deep divide between those that are okay protesting and using violence to protest and those that decry the lack of law and order. Those two narratives are present in the 1960s. You know, the hippie culture and the dropouts and the drug addicts versus the middle classes of America who want to see stability and want to see support and patriotism. It becomes that incredibly divisive time period that really wears out LBJ. And by 1968, LBJ is exhausted. Okay? The country seems to be coming apart with riots and protests, and the year opens with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. January 31st, North Vietnamese troops pile across the front lines, making massive inroads into the South. They're eventually beaten back and it stabilizes, and they inflict heavy casualties on the North Vietnamese, but it was a public relations nightmare. Walter Cronkite, the face of the trusted news media in America, is going to express public doubts about whether the Vietnamese War is winnable. If 500,000 men, money and bombs and air supremacy can't win this war, is it even winnable? By March, LBJ withdraws from his re-election bid and calls for negotiations for peace in Vietnam. By April 4th, MLK is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots, protests erupt in 130 cities across America, as does the backlashes against those protests. America in 1968 seems to be tearing itself apart as America goes to the polls. The Democrats nominate Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president. Okay. Their first choice was going to be Robert Kennedy, but in June of 1968, he's assassinated in California by Sirhan Sirhan. Republicans run Richard Nixon once again. And the independent, or running as an independent, is going to be governor of Alabama, George Wallace. And he's going to run really as a Democrat who's not Hubert Humphrey. He's going to run on that, what we could sometimes call a Dixiecrat, a Southern Democrat. Nixon promises to restore law and order, promises to go to Vietnam and end the war. And he's going to win that narrow victory on the back of those promises. But unfortunately, it's very easy to critique LBJ about his soft on communism state and his inability to end the war and the need to do all of this. Very easy to critique from the sidelines. It's much more difficult when you're the president. And how do you get out of Vietnam without looking weak? How do you solve all of the problems that are tearing America apart? And that's where we'll pick up in the next lecture.